Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the island finally. Very happy to have Deserted Island Dice returning. You'll notice a slight name change, but that's just because we want to keep this series going. We have a very special guest this time. It's Gary from Ardwulf's Lair. Sit back and enjoy it. Take in Gary's breadth of knowledge and history of the historical gaming hobby. It's really quite impressive to hear Gary talk about just not only his own progression through the hobby, but just his knowledge of things that came before my interest in the hobby. Enjoy. Welcome back to the island, everyone. It's been a while. Lucky for us and not so lucky for them. I see some castaways on the horizon. Tonight, washing ashore on a raft made of thousands and thousands of tiny little cardboard corners. We're joined by Gary, probably better known as Ardwulf.
Hey, how's it going?
Welcome to the island.
Nice to be here. Thanks for asking me.
You say that now.
Well, that's true. I'm going to have questions about this island later.
Well, there's only a few of us so far, and I think we established, like, Scarjo is on the island. We have some musicians on the island. Like, things are fine here.
As long as there's people to play games with, we'll be okay.
Yeah, assume the best. Well, Gary, I don't want you wear many hats, and I could take a stab at some of them, and I would probably miss them. So, for our listeners' sake, why don't you go ahead and just introduce yourself? Who are you?
So my name is Gary. I run a YouTube channel, and there's a blog, too, that actually predates the YouTube channel by quite a while, but I post to the blog probably an average of about once a year nowadays. So we might as well just never mention it again. But I'm probably best known for the YouTube channel Ardwulf's Lair, which it predominantly has dealt over the last 5 to 10 years with board war games. I'd say about 95% of my content is related to war game or historical game topics. The remainder devoted to science fiction stuff and maybe a little bit of RPG stuff here and there.
Awesome. That's not all, though. I think we would be remiss not to mention that you are the director of the Charles S. Roberts Awards.
This is true as of October 2022, but I don't want to like hold it over anybody, right? Because that would be lame.
Well, yeah, but I'll just go ahead and say it for you because no one wants to, and I get this. No one wants to toot their own horn. I think what you've done over the last 6 months now is really fantastic. I'm excited for the direction and all the hard work you've put into Charles S. Roberts. So it's awesome to see someone passionate do that. So good job, and looking forward to the future with it.
Well, I appreciate that, and we're just trying to make it better, build stability for the future. And it's not, of course, just me. I immediately put other people to work as soon as I took over because I'm like, I can't do all this. This is crazy. So let's. Oh, you get to do this, and you get to do. You would be good at that. So we have managed to farm out some of the effort, and that by itself is a big step and has helped a lot. So I felt like it went pretty well for the 2021 awards. It was not without its challenges and hiccups and things that we believe can be done better in the future. But if we continue to improve each year, I'll be satisfied.
What do you were kind enough to have Harold and I on to talk about the Summit Award and the Historical Board Game Awards, respectively.
Mm-hmm.
And you kind of fielded a bunch of questions at us. And what I kind of wanted to start with is what do you see the role of, and this can be broader than more games, but what's the point of even having awards? Like where do you put value in them? Because when things were kind of being restructured, I saw some like really hot takes on what the even point of the CSRs were, and I just didn't agree with them. But and that didn't come from you. That was just random YouTube comments or random talking heads. So what's the purpose in your eyes?
Of awards in general, I think this is a completely legitimate question to ask, and you can ask it in general. What is the point of awards, and in specifics, as in what is the point of this particular award? Whether that's a group of awards like the Charles S. Roberts Awards or the Oscars or whatever, or a singular award like the SD HistCon Summit Award, where it's given to one game at the end of the day. Partly it's out of a desire to recognize and to see recognition of excellence in whatever field we're talking about, right? Um, Many people will use, well, I don't know about many, there's no metric on this, right? But
Mhm.
there are somebody out there will use an Origins award or a CSR award or an Oscar or whatever to kind of get an idea, learn about something that they didn't know anything about. So we're trying to highlight excellence, and that's not going to be a perfect process, as it isn't with any award, right? I could probably give you a 20-minute rant about the Oscars and The Lion in Winter and versus Oliver in like 1968 or 1969, and who won, who should have won, and why it was all wrong. Right. So I mean, nobody gets it right. There's obviously more recent examples, right? Saving Private Ryan versus
Man and
Shakespeare in
Iron Man.
Love, for
Shakespeare in
example,
Love,
which
that's what it was. Yeah.
I think it's safe to say that the wargaming community is probably going to fall on the side of Saving Private Ryan there. I believe that to be a safe bet. So, I mean, no award's ever going to get it right, right? There's a perspective that time will grant that is a luxury that an award thing does not have, unless it's one of the very rare kinds of awards that's given decades after the fact, or for some work that is done over a really extended period, where you can kind of take a look back and get a sense of what the impact of whatever work it's going to be. I mean, if I no nobody thought the Lord of the Rings was going to be what it turned out to be, for example, when it came out, and certainly Tolkien didn't. So, and now you can go to a casino and play a Lord of the Rings slot machine.
Sure can.
Not even kidding.
Yeah, I think yeah, that's so what is Gary individually prior to you taking over? What did you see, what personal use did you get out of something like the CSRs?
Well, I kind of have paid attention to a variety of awards over the years, and not just the CSRs. As you'll recall, the CSRs were not a going concern for 7 or 8 years, or whatever the hiatus was, and so nobody was really paying any attention to that. And in the meantime, some other things popped up, maybe in response to the absence of the CSR awards for what we call conflict simulations in this context. But I had paid fairly close attention to the Hugo Awards for science fiction, for example, for several years. This did coincide with the release of the Lord of the Rings movies, I have to say. I actually held an annual Oscar party with like themed cocktails and stuff. So I was paying fairly close attention. At one point, I decided I wanted to see all of the Best Picture winners. And that effort, I think I got about 8 movies. I mean, I'd seen some of them, of course, but I got about 8 movies into that effort, and then I hit The English Patient, which made me want to undergo euthanasia. And in fact, it's the only movie that has put me to sleep during the opening credits twice. I tried to watch it, dozed off during the opening credits. Next night, tried to watch it again, fell asleep again during the opening credits. And I finally managed to get through it with the assistance of an enormous amount of caffeine. And it is, in fact, just as boring a film as I thought it was the first time. But so I've kind of paid attention to that, right? I mean, in theory, awards, and you're never going to agree. You can go through any awards list, the Oscars or the Hugos or the World Fantasy Awards or whatever it is, and pick out which things you thought were like worthy of the award in comparison to the other things that were out at that time, and which weren't. And of course, this is the same thing with when Rolling Stone releases their greatest 100 songs of all time. And everybody looks at the top 10 and says, what? What are these people? What kind of dope are these people on? So, I mean, it's the same thing. Ideally, it raises awareness and is a conversation starter, right? So, what do you think about Atlantic Chase that won all those CSR awards last year, right? We didn't plan that. That's just how it worked out.
That's good. I couldn't help but think when you talked about English Patient a few years ago, I got a wild hair up my ass to go read all the Hugo Award winners starting in the 1950s, and like there's some I did not get very far
Mm-hmm.
there's some works, but that's good. We're not going to talk CSRs all night. You've There's been plenty of chatter about awards for historical board games over the last few months. We're really here to talk about our Deserted Island games. This is Deserted Island Dice afterwards, so let's get one out of the way. And I think I saved what I think will be some of the best for last, and that is, let's start with Deserted Island card game. If you could wash ashore with one card game, and you can stretch this definition as you will, what would it be?
Okay, so we're making assumptions here like there's people to play with on the island. Maybe there's even decent internet on the island, which would be unlike my place right now. Um, I'm not a big card game player. Okay, if I played the round of 19-year-old college student playing euchre in the dorm rooms late at night and that kind of stuff, and that was fine and all that. But I'm not really into what I would consider card games, and I don't have what I would consider, if we think about the modern commercial space of card games that aren't just played with the standard 52 card deck. Um, the one I've played a fair amount of, and I feel I could play more of, and I think I could get a decent amount of continued enjoyment out of it, considering you can buy a lot of additional material for it, is probably the Pathfinder collectible card game. It kind of boils down to it's a cooperative game, right? You could play it solitaire, you could play it with 6 people, you could probably play it with more people than that. Although balance might break down if you play it with more than that, but it's pretty flexible, and it's kind of built around these story arcs which correspond to the Pathfinder adventure paths. So it's pretty fun to play. It gives you a sense of an RPG like experience in a card game.
Okay, very good. Not necessarily where I saw you going with that. That's certainly a choice I can get behind and respect. I want to back up before, and you mentioned some of this when you were introducing yourself, but pre CSRs and pre YouTube channel and stuff. Let's just talk about your journey, right? And so one of the intents of doing Deserted Island Dads was I was going off on paternity leave, and I just wanted to sit down with people and just recollect on memories of gaming. So do you have an early, did you have a young fondness for gaming, or was it something you found later in life?
No, I started hobby gaming even pretty young, right? I mean, the only none of my family has any interest in gaming, books, anything that would require them to read or do arithmetic in their heads. So it was kind of a tough slog at home when I was a real young kid. But I mean, I was always attracted to this, and then of course I had friends who would play various things. I think that the games we had at home were pretty much Monopoly, and Risk and Monopoly were the only ones I remember.
Okay.
Um, but I got a bug up my like 9-year-old butt about. We used to get this magazine. I think it might still be around, but it might maybe a web-based magazine called Science News. And it was like this, and my parents bought it because it was like 50 cents, because it's like a 16-page magazine. And hey, it's science, says science on it. This is probably educational. Whatever, shut this kid up, right? They'd be delighted. So I had some issues with this, and in one of those issues was an advertisement for Strategy and Tactics magazine.
Oh,
And I must have talked my parents into getting me like the cheapest possible subscription, which I don't really have a clear recollection of what that was. But I don't actually remember. I remember 2 of the games that arrived, right? And this was with the magazine, and you got the SPI flat tray with your first issue and all that stuff. And I remember the first issue was S&T, it's like 78 or something like that. So the game was Paratroop. And I managed to cajole my dad into play that a couple times, and eventually played it a couple times with friends. The other game that I remember was the China War. Those were in back-to-back issues. I think Paratroop came first and the China War came second. And I don't know if these were new issues or not, because if they were, I think they're both 1979, very early 1980 games, which would put me at 9 years old at the time. I was a precocious child. So those were actually, that Paratroop was actually my first hobby game of any kind. Now, around that time, though, we started hearing about this Dungeons and Dragons business.
okay.
And there were some friends from school that were playing Dungeons and Dragons. And I wasn't really hooked up with those people. And none of them like lived right across the street or anything. So I didn't play for what was probably, I assume, until about 1981. And that I can date pretty precisely to my 10th birthday. So I kind of like, there's also an old book, and I don't know what the date on this was. I don't really remember, but it was definitely an early memory, a book called Fantasy Wargaming by Bruce Galloway, which was kind of a early reaction to D&D type of thing. And there's a game in it, right? It was sold as a like an actual hardcover book. And there's a game in it, and that game is one of the most impenetrable games ever published, I think. And I'm not sure anybody ever actually tried to play it, but that was an early memory. I probably started playing D&D in late spring, summer of 1981. Within a couple of years, of course, everybody moved on to AD&D as quickly as they could back then.
Okay.
Within a couple of years, I had started to get more interested in other things. Probably the second RPG I was exposed to, I want to say, was probably Champions. There was a group up at the local library of significantly older people that was playing, not old people, but older than me at the time, that was playing Champions on a regular basis at the local library. Another early game that I was exposed to relatively early was Traveler. And I want to say that was right around the time when they phased out the core set that was sold in the little black books and moved to either the hardcover Traveler book or the Traveler starter set. I forget which order those occurred in. A lot of this, to some extent, I'm piecing this together decades after the fact, right? As far as order of publication, which doesn't necessarily reflect the order I experienced these things in. Other early contact with games was, Avalon Hill games. By the time I got into games, SPI was either dead already or very near the end of its life. So by the time, there was like actual like lawn mowing money or something like that, that stuff was simply not available. But Avalon Hill stuff was, and was pretty accessible too. You could go to Sears and buy that stuff at the time. So a lot of that experience in the 80s revolved around what were the then popular RPGs and or Avalon Hill games. So even though I started with SPI, I'm not sure I played another SPI game until sometime in the 90s.
Okay, so you had your first hit on war games with Paratroop, and then to me it sounds like it was a steady off and on hit ever since that first taste.
Yes.
Okay.
But I've gone in and out of war games at that time, right? Around the time I hit high school, we were playing a lot of Risk, to be honest about it. But we were also playing a fair amount of D&D and other stuff. RuneQuest, at the Avalon Hill edition of RuneQuest at that came around in 87. So this would have been mid high school years for me. So in my high school years and out of college, just out of college, I didn't, the first time anyway, I probably didn't have much contact with war games and because kind of re-entered war games with some other folks who played both RPGs and war games in the early 90s. And that was kind of the status quo for quite a while until those people got other interests. Kind of the driving force there decided he was, instead of playing war games to satisfy his historical urges, he was going to become a World War II reenactor.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, so I did have contact with him for quite a while. And so I again, kind of stopped playing war games, but I was still paying attention to what seemed at the time to be the wargaming scene, and I was still occasionally buying war games and stuff like that. And then around, this is probably around 2000 to 2005, it seemed to me, I'm kind of spitballing on the exact dates here. It kind of seemed to me, it's like, Avalon Hill's gone now. SPI's been gone for a long time. All the wargame publishers are starting to abandon these conventions that I was going to, like Gen Con and Origins. I think this is dying. And really kind of the only thing that I knew was still happening on a steady basis was Advanced Squad Leader. And I was not at the time inclined to deal with that. So I dumped a lot of war games and just kind of lost track of things for a number of years. It's kind of like comics now, where I was a big comics reader for a while.
Sure.
for quite a while, actually. And it's still kind of on my radar because let's face it, I know a lot of nerds. So I still hear about it, some of the stuff that goes on. It's not like I'm completely blind to what's going on, but I haven't bought a comic book in probably 20 years.
Mm.
Not because I, decided that. It's just I kind of drifted away from it. And it was kind of like that with wargaming too, right? I heard that GMT was starting this whole new P500 madness, for example. So, but probably around that time was probably around the last time I bought anything from GMT for quite a while. But I mean, I remember when they were at Origins every year, and I would buy stuff from them. And for all I know, I might have met some of the big shots that, I wish I had engaged with, like Richard Berg, for instance.
Sure.
But then I got back in sometime around 2010, about 2007, about 2008, 2009. I started to realize that all of my interests were kind of revolving around history. It was like reading history and playing historically flavored RPGs. And at around that same time, I started thinking about going back to school and actually finishing. And so in the course of that experience, which of course it always takes longer than you expect it to take, right? And in my case, there was a changeover in the middle of it between semesters or from quarters, academic quarters to semesters, which I think cost me about a year. But around that, in the middle of that experience, I'm like, hey, I'm really into history. I think I'm just going to get a history degree. And that was that kind of right. And that started to spark, a revival of interest in wargaming, which of course I assumed, well, I'm going to have to get into ASL now, aren't I? So I started looking into that, and I started looking into YouTube and seeing there's kind of a lot of I mean, it's not a lot, but there's like way more wargaming stuff here on YouTube than I was aware of. At the time, we had Stuka Joe at the time, who had relatively recently done his legendary playthrough series of B-17 Queen of the Skies. I want to say Callendale was around that early. Joe Stedman was around that early. Some other folks, Derek Case was around that time. So there was a decent number of folks that were like doing content. And I had already had a YouTube channel because I had been covering video games on the blog was very active for a while. This just isn't in it anymore on the subject of video games. This was kind of in the golden age of video game bloggers, right?
Sure.
MMORPG bloggers. So I had done, 30 or 40 videos over the course of a few years on various video game topics, primarily MMORPG type things. And I started doing, I'm like, hell, why not do wargame videos? So I started doing it with like really stupid stuff. My very first wargame video is like a 3-minute explanation of what's what on the Panzer Grenadier counters.
Okay.
And you cannot find that video nowadays because it's actually on my regular, like, personal channel that I had as, just a YouTube account, and not like the channel I created to actually make stuff. So nobody's really, it's not private or anything, but nobody's really ever seen that. And then I did a video on, I forget what the sequence was here, but it was probably the Hunters or possibly a Distant Plane, that hey, somebody watch this, right? I did this like epic 60+ episode playthrough of Hearts of Iron 3, which is a video game, World War II. That was fairly wargaming at the time. And, this is like a 65 episode thing, and it probably took me 100 hours to play, and it was minimally edited because I didn't really roll that way. So it was a decent time commitment to do. And the views per video were like 6 people have watched this video in the 3 months since it was released. But then I did the one of the early videos, either a Distant Plane or the Hunters or something like that, which I went to the local store and I'm like, hey, there's like 20 war games here. And those were very early pickups once I got back in. Of course, I dumped a lot, but not all, thankfully, not all of my war games in the dead years there. So I have since reacquired a bunch of them. So I'm reluctant to sell anything anymore unless I'm positive that I'm not going to want it later on. But one of those took off, and it's like, hey, there's like 150 people have watched this thing. This is like, maybe I should make another one. I made another one. And it's, now it's it's been, officially 15 plus years since the start of the blog. And then another, it was probably 2 years after that I started the YouTube channel. And now I'm like over 1,000 videos. So, and I have been covering war games and like I said, the occasional sci-fi or RPG thing for, close to 10 years on YouTube. So, and, so for some reason, people choose to watch that stuff in their free time. I can't explain it.
I mean, this isn't an ego stroke or anything. I legitimately mean this every time I say it, that it's still humbling to me that people even, I don't want to speak for you, but I still just find it shocking. Like, because, I have this background, right? Like my first podcast was my brother and I doing retro video games, and I still love retro video games, but it's just, there's so many things you can talk about. And then I did comics, and you see those really minuscule numbers, and then History on the Table, like, it's still, when I see those, I'm just like, holy shit. And it's not, come on, I'm not fooling anyone here. It's not groundbreaking or anything, but it is, I love doing this, and it's so fun. And I think, I don't want to speak for you, but it appears you're not slowing down at all. And as a matter of fact, it really, like, I've noticed, at least, or at least maybe I'm just more aware, like a giant ramp up in everything you're doing on your channel. And that's really cool. So I assume you're doing it.
There's been a bit of a dip over the last 5 months or so, actually.
Oh, really?
For a couple reasons. One is that, the Charles S. Roberts Award sucked a lot of the oxygen out of this place. Beginning in October and really running through probably January. And that's less now because of the way we've set things up, so that it's not like, holy cow, I have 100 hours of work on this that I have to get done by like the end of, 10 days from now. So we're going to try and avoid that. And part of it is that we bought a house and moved, and that was a huge time sink, and, getting everything unboxed, which is, by the way, still not done. The war games are all unboxed and have been unboxed for just a moment, but the RPGs are not quite unboxed and shelved yet. All right, I believe we are recovered from this technical snafu. You could put that in the blooper reel if you want. I don't mind.
No, that's fine. Well, I think you were mid thought there, but I hope things do ramp up. Some of this is just my awareness, because my introduction to wargaming was around the time of the U.S. Civil War release, and so I'm just a young pup in this hobby, and you've experienced many more iterations. And I have this kind of nebulous question I want to ask you, but I do want to knock a game out, and I think it's one that, again, saving the juicy ones for last. So let's go ahead and knock out, if you watched ashore with a game, a non-war game board game, what would you wash ashore with?
Well, that's a great question. The wise guy of me wants to say Twilight Struggle.
Hey, got him.
But, I'm just poking fun at Twilight Struggle at this point. I almost did a game store review of a local game store's war game selection. With something to the effect of, they only had 3 war games, but they had Twilight Struggle too. So, and then, a game that's a game I might otherwise favor, something like War of the Ring, the more recent one from Fantasy Flight or Ares or whoever the hell's doing it now. That's a really good game. I've played that, but BGG calls it a war game, and I'm inclined to not be sufficiently energized to argue about it. I have sort of limited bandwidth to work with here, right? Between the house and the family and the channel and the CSR awards and work and, a variety of other, and I'm, miraculously somehow still managing to actually play games at least once a week. So my bandwidth is pretty narrow, right? So I found myself dealing with that by sort of slicing things away that I'm less into. And so I'm really pretty tightly focused right now on war games and specific RPGs. Okay. So this is another space where there's like this whole universe of things that have released in the last 20 years, a couple of which I've played, right? I mean, I'm not like a hermit here. I've played Terraforming Mars, and I've played a few of these other things. But very few of those things have I said after playing for the first time. Have I said, I need to go order that because that was a really cool experience. One of the few things that did happen with is Lords of Waterdeep, which is a Wizards of the Coast game. It is a straight worker placement Euro set in the Forgotten Realms. And I'm not the biggest fan of D&D, Wizards of the Coast, or the Forgotten Realms, but it's a lot of fun to play. It has good mechanics, and it has a good amount of good Forgotten Realms flavor. So it is not unlike, say, something like the Pathfinder Adventure card game, where it does it's not an RPG, but it replicates a lot of elements of the RPG experience. Right. Lords of Waterdeep is not like that. It is a worker placement game. You're playing a worker placement game. It does not feel like an RPG in any way. It just has some of the color and flavor and background and all that is associated with Waterdeep and the Forgotten Realms in particular. But it's great. There is an expansion, which is one of those rare expansions that does not feel rare in my experience, that does not feel like it adds bloat to the game. It adds cool things, but not too much. And they have somehow managed to only come out with that one expansion. And I assume at this point that they're not going to come out with another one.
Yeah, it's a little bit surprising because just the trend on that side of the hobby, I think, has been to just pump out, milk those cows till they're dry, and it's Wizards of the Coast. So
yeah.
That's also a little surprising.
Not exactly shy about sucking at the customer teat. And they've done plenty of other board games and games and D&D board games specifically. They've done a pile of them since Lords of Waterdeep. And I've played a couple of those, and something like Wrath. I forget which one it is, and I'll get the title wrong. But there's another one of those D&D board games that I played, and it was, after having had a real good time with Lords of Waterdeep, and it's basically Axis and Allies with little plastic dragons, and which is fine. It was fine. There was nothing wrong with it, but I didn't run out and buy it either. Lords of Waterdeep, I went out and bought.
Well, great. Well, the good news is, Gary, on the island, all we have is time. So, Lord of Waterdeep.
Oh, that's the most precious. I mean, I'm not even kidding or trying to be facetious here. Time, as you get older, I think everybody will agree with me of a certain age. Time becomes the most valuable currency, right?
Sure.
It's it's the time that I'm most poor on.
Yeah, I mean, we can go very deep on time after a certain age, I'm sure. But I do have another just kind of more nebulous question, bringing it back to war games, and I'll just clarify here. We have this conversation about Twilight, or you bring up Twilight Struggle, War of the Ring, or whatever. For purposes of the podcast, so I don't have to say it over and over again. Generally, when we're talking war games, and I think this is for both of us, we're talking about the broader reach of war games, historical board games, consim games, whatever definition you want to use, because that'll come up later when we do the hot seat. That I don't want to say 10 times over, like, what's your favorite war game, historical board game, conflict simulate? Right?
Yeah, I mean, so to be honest about it, this isn't a question I personally am terribly concerned about.
Right. Yes.
I know, I poke fun at it, and I hope people know that I'm poking fun at it. And I like Twilight Struggle. But whether a game is like a war game or is war game adjacent or is a semi-war game or pseudo war game or fake war game or what, who cares, man?
Right. Thank you.
To me, it's more important. Now there's a parallel line of thought here too, but to me personally, as a gamer, it's more important that the game be fun, that it be interesting. A lot of that's based on topics, some of it's based on mechanics, some of it's based on physical appeal. Those are all more important things to whatever arbitrary category we want to put it in. Which yes. Recognize that these definitions have shifted over the years radically, right? Which brings up the other dimension that I unfortunately have to consider, which is how does this relate to whether a game is eligible for an award for a best such and such conflict simulation, right?
Sure.
So that is unfortunately a thing that we sometimes have to decide. But it's going to be my preference to make those. Well, so my preference is going to be to democratize that decision. So that I am not the one person in a closed room somewhere literally in a basement right now, making these decisions based on God knows what criteria that such and such a game is eligible or isn't eligible.
Mhm.
That seemed to me to be completely untransparent and undesirable for that reason alone. And I frankly want to hear what other people think too, right? I will be happy to change my opinion on the face of new information. Um, so that's kind of an angle that I am now in a position where I have to think about. But personally, I am going to probably lean toward inclusivity in that
Yes.
definition,
Yep.
because I have seen the absolute fruitlessness of having this continued, like actual, not two guys having fun, but like actual vitriolic arguments erupt over this nonsense. This is in no sense worthy of that level of attention or acrimony. So I am happy to say, you know what? Does it feel like a war game to you? Cool. Good
Preach,
enough for
brother.
me.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree 1,000%. And that actually was not the nebulous question that I was going to ask you. What I was going to ask you, that was just the framework of when I say war game here, broader reach, right? I have this idea in my mind, whether it's right or wrong, but we're early in 2023. What kind of identity do you think our little pocket of the hobby, this war game pocket, has right now? Where do you think we're going? I think there was this, at least when I was getting into war games, I think there was this, like, coin maybe shifted that identity a little bit. I think it allowed for new and creative approaches to wargaming. We don't have to use all these cardboard bits or all these miniature dudes. We can Euro gamify the hobby or whatnot. So do you think we're kind of shifting towards a new identity? And whether you do or don't think that, what do you think the 2023 identity of wargame as a hobby is right now? Again,
So
nebulous, but
So back in that fallow period that I talked about, where it seemed to me, and I was not alone in that, I was wrong, fortunately, but where it seemed like wargaming was in fact, going to be dying anytime now. Recognize that there have literally been people saying this stuff since like the early 70s. Okay. Literally in 1975, there's somebody writing into the Strategic Review. It's not even Dragon Magazine yet. Somebody writing into the Strategic Reviews that says that D&D and wargaming are dying. Man, this thing's only a year old. What do you mean it's dying? They cannot keep it in the warehouse shelves in Gary's garage. So there's I think a certain amount of doom and gloom sentiment that just kind of always circulates in the hobby, and sometimes that can feel more justified than at other times. It certainly has felt justified to me at certain points in the past, and I think there was a real danger when where we were in the kind of that fallow time between kind of the rise of GMT as a really thriving company and the demise of Avalon Hill. And of course, again, SPI's long gone, where the visibility of war games dipped precipitously, particularly if you were making assumptions that you may not have questioned as assumptions at the time, like what I am seeing at Origins is reflective of the hobby, right? That turned out not to be correct. Not long after that, they started doing Monster Con out in wherever it was at first. I don't know if that was Tempe or not. That's CS Console World Expo. And that started drawing people playing giant, monster games for a week. So there's no question, though, that over the last 20 years, that I don't want to use the word complexion, but that the sort of vibe, if you will, of the hobby has changed. I wouldn't chalk that up to coin, because Twilight Struggle, for example, predates coin.
Yep.
Twilight Struggle does not itself arise from the timeless void, right? Twilight Struggle harkens back to games like We the People, for instance, right? So we're once again returning full circle to it's all Mark Herman's fault. But I say that only partially tongue in cheek. But even if you go back to like the 70s, right, where Dunnigan was doing these absolutely outside the box, not outside the box fell off the boat on the way over to our shores. And there's no box. And there's a number of examples like that where he's thinking completely in a different space than everybody around him. Games like, and we're talking like 1970 for the origins of World War II, for example. Mid 70s, something like that for the plot to assassinate Hitler, which was a more conventional game, less conventional game than it looks like because it's played on a hex grid. But the hex grid doesn't represent a physical territory; it represents like this a political space. Absolutely bananas. And there were other innovators at that time, Tom Douglas, a number of other individuals that you could point to that, some of whom transformed the hobby, right? Remember that not just in 1974, but for at least a half decade afterwards, role-playing games were not considered different from war games. They were still, they were different, but they're still war games, right? That identity of role-playing games as a completely separate thing really didn't even start to emerge until the early 80s. Maybe the very late 70s. So you could see similar sort of fragmentation in something like science fiction and fantasy now, right? Back in the 20s when guys like Clark Ashton Smith and H.P. Lovecraft were writing this, there was no, Hugo Gernsback had just come up with the word science fiction or scientifiction or whatever Hugo was calling it. There was no notion that it was somehow, well, this is science based, so this is different than this other thing, which is witchcraft based. It was all just weird fiction, right? And there were sort of intellectual strains of it or political strains, like you might have seen out of Jules Verne or H.G. Wells, and then the pulp strains. There were identifiable trends. But the identities of those different branches of fiction into science fiction, fantasy, and horror, which you see as separate sections now in a bookstore, and have for some time, that took time to evolve, and we're seeing the same type of thing in war games. I have complete confidence that the hex encounter, even if we talk about straight hex encounter, no cards, a pox on your table if you bring cards to me. None of that is none of that's going to go away in my lifetime. Complete confidence that traditional hex encounter stuff will outlive me, because people don't like to recognize this, but the people who don't recognize this aren't the people going to the conventions and seeing that there are in fact younger people showing up at these things from time to time. So it's not just old geezers. But at the same time, we can also identify strains of games that share a lot with those traditional games. I'd include coin in that, right? I think some coin games are certainly war games, along with other historical games that maybe borrow some mechanical things from war games, but don't really resemble war games. So I think we're in an evolution of the wargaming space. There's certainly no revolution, but I don't think we're in terminal decline either.
Yeah, and that's certainly not my outlook on the hobby either, but I do think clearly you're way more versed at identifying those moments. But there are, I think, these moments.
I've had shows to prep for.
Well, there's just, you've lived them, right? I mean, if my intro to the hobby is U.S. Civil War and Wilderness War, which had been out for a couple of years, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then you just live them and see them more. And so, like identifying these moments with games that have an impact on how war games are designed, I think it's interesting. And I think I agree with you. I think there is, for good or for bad, I don't think it's for bad, there is a trend right now that I think is, how far can we push this? I haven't given this much concrete thought, so I'm kind of flying by the seat of my pants here. But if I kind of look at the hobby right now, I think it's this, how can we're really pushing the blending. I think of things like Undaunted or the recent announcement of a worker placement war game, right? From and same designers and stuff. So that's the current trend I see. And then of course you have all the continued I mean, I really think we're at a high point, but I haven't really experienced a low point, so I don't know what we're at right now. But I do kind of think that's the identity I would somewhat assign to our hobby. I don't know.
Well, I mean, there's also, I mean, clearly, as you know, as a part of larger trends, there has been a renaissance in interest in war games. Okay,
Sure.
even if
Yeah.
we just use our narrow definition of war games,
Right.
and that has been largely assisted by two big factors. One, maybe three, if you count COVID. The two big factors I'm thinking of are the broader board game boom,
Sure.
which I think, as a number of folks have tried to make the case, has been largely in reaction to video games, right? Because everybody was predicting for years that, hey, these analog tabletop things, these are going to go away. The computer games are going to, we're just all going to be playing computer games in 5 years. I mean, Jim Dunnigan was saying that in like 1981. um, I'm pleased to report that Mr. Dunnigan was incorrect. So so to some extent, right? And I completely feel like this. I spend like 12 hours a day in front of a computer. I'll be honest, I have not, part of it said my computer sucks, but I haven't touched a video game in 6 months.
Yeah.
Not booted, not loaded, not played, nothing. And I'm not like philosophically opposed to video games or anything. It's just that I already spend 12 hours a day in front of this computer. I want to like go out and cut the grass or something, and if I can, get out of the house and go and play a game with some people without the computer in front of me for a few hours, that's great. So that's certainly a factor, right, in this sort of analog game renaissance that we're experiencing right now. And the rising tide that has lifted all boats has included not just board games and Euro games, but also RPGs and war games.
Yes. Yeah, it really has. And I think, in past episodes of this particular series, I've kind of talked about, like, why do we play war games? And obviously there's historical interest, but then there's war games are escape, right? And I think that's an interesting, not only is an escape from all the stresses and things going on in our life and the world or whatever, but you're right, it's still very much an escape from, because I'm right there with you. Like, my job is an office job, constantly in front of the computer, and having the step away and be able to just touch things and have that tactile feel and not be in front of a screen. Yeah, there's a whole nother reason why we do this. All right. We still have three deserted island games to knock out. Let's do, again, working towards quote unquote best for last. Deserted island miniature game. If you could wash ashore with the miniatures game. Again, you can stretch the definition or you can take the standard approach.
I'm going to select whichever miniatures game comes included with a revolver and one bullet.
Not like a raft or something.
If I'm forced to play a miniatures game, escape is, there is no escape. So I,
okay.
I'm poking fun here, right? Because I have no actual acts to bear against miniatures games. But I simply do not have the bandwidth for miniatures games.
Right.
That said, I played, 40K when 40K came out as a hardcover book called Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader. And I continued to play 40K here and there for quite a while. I played War Machine when that was hot. I played and actually still have a large army sitting unpainted in a plastic box in the garage. The Lord of the Rings whatever it was called, the Lord of the Rings miniatures game from Games Workshop, which was fun, when I played it. But as time has gone on and my, personal, mental and financial bandwidth has become smaller and smaller, miniatures games were kind of like the first thing to get excised. So I have certainly the trouble is I'd be giving up another hobby to do miniatures, right?
Right.
Because miniatures are themselves a hobby. That said, if we're counting a game that has miniatures that I shouldn't feel obligated to paint and doesn't require an ever revolving treadmill of new miniatures purchase, I'd probably lean into that War of the Ring, that recent War of the Ring second edition from Ares or whoever it is. I've played that. It's very good.
Awesome. I think that's a perfectly valid choice, and I like it.
So other than, the one with the gun and the bullet.
All right, you spent a good amount of time talking about RPGs, and I do find that link in common lineage from modern RPGs and modern war games and how different they are now. But it is interesting to hear about their shared origin, right? Um, I am worried that Traveler shelf is going to fall on you one day, but
It
let's
is
put
much sturdy. That is an artifact of the of the photo. I was looking at the photo after I had posted it, and I'm like, is that thing Boeing already? What the hell? And I like went and checked it, and it is not. That is just an artifact of the photo. It is great. That said,
good.
there's a lot of weight on that shelf.
It looked like it, and I don't want to make any assumptions, so I will ask, just so we keep making progress, because we still have plenty of stuff to talk about. Is what's your deserted island RPG?
I mean, obviously it's Traveler. Okay. Um,
Okay, well let me interject here because I I've dabbled in some Traveler, and my question for you, and I know you're going to explain it here, why Traveler in particular versus there is a worlds and universes that we couldn't even begin to list them all that you could use for RPGs. So why Traveler as your wash ashore?
so as part of my sort of narrowing bandwidth project, I also stopped buying RPG stuff, except for just a few product lines.
Okay.
Those product lines are pretty much basic role playing from Chaosium and a few other publishers. And in this context, that means Call of Cthulhu and RuneQuest and
Mhm.
Mythros, I suppose.
Okay.
Traveler, obviously, and Harn from Columbia Games, and in parallel, Celestia Publications. I'll occasionally buy something else in PDF, but I'm not buying physical product for anything else at this point.
Mhm.
There's certainly a lot of other RPGs that I like. There are other RPGs that I would be happy to play. We're about to start a monthly GURPS campaign, for example,
Nice.
which I'm hoping it's on the calendar. We're using a calendar now to manage this stuff. So, but Traveler gives you something that almost no other RPG does. It's got solitaire capability. You could keep yourself entertained with Traveler without other people there. And that comes in the form of a variety of mini games that have been built into Traveler from the very beginning. Character creation is a mini game. You might die, right? That
Mhm.
hasn't actually been true since Classic Traveler, but we still say that. And it's optional in a variety of other editions. You can generate universes. Traveler gives you like a complete universe generation kit right in those 3 little black books, again from day one. In addition to that, it's still a really robust RPG, right? And if you don't think it's robust enough, you can just pick any of the 11 other versions of Traveler, some of which are very close to the original and some of which are radically different. So you have kind of a huge system space to work in, right? And I could also cheat and include GURPS Traveler, which means I'm including GURPS, which means I can use that for anything. But I have everything ever published for GURPS Traveler. So um, I also like science fiction gaming. I think it's not. I think it is an underrepresented genre in RPGs. And my personal tastes in science fiction are, I won't say 100% aligned with Traveler, but are completely compatible with Traveler. Right.
Okay.
So as a science fiction system, it is not generic, just like D&D is not actually generic fantasy. D&D is D&D fantasy, and Traveler is Traveler science fiction. There are built-in assumptions and an implied setting in those games that you're not going to get away from. But I'm
Right.
comfortable with the implied setting in Traveler and the assumptions that it's built on. Um, and in the case of Traveler, the people making it actually understood those assumptions and leaned into them. And I think Gary and Dave designing D&D kind of stumbled into those dimensions, and then they evolved over the course of the first several years of D&D's life. Um, I can hack Traveler to do various things. There are fantasy hacks of Traveler, for example. They're weird, but that doesn't mean they're not worthwhile. The Sword of Cepheus is a recent Cepheus engine based fantasy sword and sorcery flavored fantasy hack of Traveler that I could use that for all kinds of stuff. So I mentioned that at various times I've sold a lot of games over the years. I mean, I've been doing this for over 40 years now, and I've sold and dumped a lot of stuff. And sometimes the motivation for that is, hey, this new thing came out. I really want to buy this new thing, but I don't have the money for this new thing, so I'll sell some of my old games to buy the new thing.
Mhm.
And that of course means that a lot of my old stuff, like all my old D&D stuff, I have a decent D&D collection. I've got like all the first edition AD&D core books, for example. But I dumped it all and have reacquired that slowly over the years. Ending some years ago. I never dumped my Traveler stuff. I have almost no RPG products from the early 80s that I had back, that were like, this was my copy back in 1982, except Traveler. I never got rid of anything. So it's not like I'm new to it. I'm not the world's greatest authority on the official Traveler universe or any of that stuff, but I have been a big Traveler fan for a very long time. I've played every edition except Hero Traveler, which I've never even seen or owned. And I like the system. I like the setting. I like the dynamism involved in the random character creation. It's the system that, after decades of thinking about it, led me to believe that the problems I always had with D&D character generation were not problems inherent to character generation randomness, but to D&D's implementation of those ideas and the system that accompanied it. I think all that works great in Traveler. I'm happy to deal with the characters occasionally dying before you start playing.
I think those are all great reasons. As someone who has only very briefly experienced Traveler, and if I'm new to war games, I'm even newer to RPGing, just 3 years worth of RPGing here. I find it fascinating, and then I find it really interesting that in my mind, Traveler is this massive universe with all this lore and universe generation stuff you can do that has been around and people know about it. But it's also sounding like, just even as a system, there's so many cool levers to pull, and that's why you'd wash ashore with it. And I think there's probably enough books and content out there that you could build an escape raft for everyone on the island.
If paper floats, yeah, I might be able to.
Oh yeah, we'll need some paste or something, I'm sure,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, mechanically, it's different in each system, right? But even if you look at, aside from the sort of actual branches like GURPS Traveler or Hero Traveler or whatever, it's remained relatively consistent as a system. It's a 2d6 skill-based system. It was one of the first skill-based RPGs back in 1977. So I think there's a lot to like about it mechanically. But even if you think say Classic Traveler is just a little too skeletal for you, which is an opinion I could certainly sympathize with. Well, you got other options. You've got Cepheus Engine or either the Mongoose editions or 4th edition or whatever. So it's kind of got, even though it's not a universal system, it's got a lot of different aspects and themes you can explore with it. And that's one of the reasons why I like it. I also really like the official Traveler universe, but I also really kind of want to design my own universe for it too. So,
well, I assume that was going to be your choice for RPGs.
I'm slightly transparent when it comes to answering this particular question.
Now, I have a guess as to what at least maybe a series you would pick for the next one, but I'll let you tell us what it is. So if you washed ashore with one deserted island war game, what would it be?
So it's funny you should ask, because we actually had this conversation. I think just before you had asked me, actually about a week before you had asked me to be on the show with this pitch, I had this same conversation at Winterfest. So I'm curious, because I'm going to give you the same answer I gave 2 or 3 weeks ago, because my opinion hasn't changed since then. But if you ask me 3 weeks from now, it might change. So before I tell you, and I have I have an alibi, so I could verify that this was what I said 2 weeks ago. I would like to hear what your guess is.
Okay, so this is from my viewpoint looking in, and I could be way off base here. So I'm gonna qualify here because since you're holding me to it, I'm gonna guess that you're gonna pick, and maybe I'm wrong here, like one of the big monster OCS titles, but maybe not. Now I'm thinking maybe not.
So this is actually a pretty legitimate guess. However, I would try and squeeze in the technicality of including the entire OCS system rather than a single title, because that's one of the attractions, right? It's I can play East Front, I can play West Front, I can play North Africa, I can play Burma, I can play all. Because to me, a system is tightly constructed and managed. Not all systems are. This is true of, but OCS has always been. There's always been kind of a guiding hand behind it, right? OCS Volume 3 feels like OCS Volume 18, right? I can sit down and bust out Hube's Pocket tomorrow and then, finish that up and play the Hube's Pocket scenario in Third Winter. And it's going to be different because it's two different designers. And the maps are slightly different. The OBs are slightly different, but it's going to be the same game, right? It's going to feel like the same game. I'm going to be using the same rules. So I tend to classify games in terms of systems, right? And it's that's very attractive because it allows me to learn one system and play a bunch of different games.
Oh, of
right?
course.
And some series games are not that tightly constrained, right? Coin games, for example, I think differ way more from game to game than one OCS game does to another OCS game. And that's not to say there's not like completely new out of left field things in any given OCS game. Sometimes there are, but it still feels like the same game. You're not changing any of the underlying assumptions or mechanics. You're only changing game specific details. Coin games aren't like that. The No Peace Without Spain series from Compass is not like that. Other series that are like that would be the Grand Tactical series, a lot from MMP. So I'll also say CSS, another Adam Starkweather series from Compass. The Library of Napoleonic Battles.
Next War.
Those games. The GMT Next War series, yes. I haven't played enough of those to have a really firm opinion on it. I've only played like one intro scenario from India, Pakistan. But it feels like it too. So like a tightly constrained series, I'd be inclined to count for purposes of, our hypothetical discussion here. I'd be inclined to count the coin games as individual games, but the OCS games as a series where I'm just buying an additional box with additional scenarios and components.
Okay, Gary, hold on. I that was very moving and convincing. You get one box.
This said, OCS is not my choice.
Okay.
I just think that OCS is I think it's a reasonable decision. And I could easily take a Case Blue or a Third Winter and play it for a long time and be satisfied with that.
Sure.
My choice 3 weeks ago, and I think I'm still in the same place today, is World in Flames.
Okay.
which is a one box solution.
Sure.
And one of three different boxes, in fact. And that's because it's kind of a sandbox,
Yep.
right? It's a World War II creation kit. Which, and if you're talking my one box is the Super Deluxe, that includes Days of the Decision too. So my World War II may differ dramatically from yours. I think it's got a robust enough system that's been tested and refined over the years. Not that it's perfect, but you can always make house rules on the island. In fact, there's a huge number of what are effectively house rules included in the book that you can mix and match from as you desire. I feel like if I were a one game person, that in sort of my space and games that I've played and that I know I enjoy, there's relatively few games. I'm not fundamentally a narrow focus gamer by disposition, right? I like to play a lot of different stuff, which I have to is a thing I have to fight now because I don't have the time to play a lot of different stuff.
Right there with you.
There's relatively few games in my space that I think I could, if I really had to, I could just play this. OCS is probably on that short list. There might be other games on that short list, but I think, again, today, if you ask me 2 weeks from now, I might say something different. But today, I think my answer is World in Flames. I think I'd be satisfied with that. It's got the replay value where I could basically play it forever, and the fact that it takes a year to play any individual game certainly helps too. But I think World in Flames.
I think that's a great choice. I mean, a sandbox choice is certainly the way to go. As soon as I really started to dive into OCS, I think, yeah, is it a fantastic system with great game design? Absolutely. But if you're stuck on a deserted island, like, you want something, not that OCS doesn't have a depth of stuff to explore. You want something that's going to allow you to play in your own little sandbox. And I think World in Flames is one of the best examples of that in historical board gaming. Solid choice. Solid choices all around.
Thank you.
Okay,
like
Garrett.
I said, I gave this a little bit of thought.
Oh, that's good. No, I think that's a great choice. I'm trying to we have an office administrator now for the podcast, and I have suggested to them that they need to make a list of everyone else's pick, because I was never smart enough to actually start writing these down, because it would be interesting to be like, you can watch ashore with 5 games, but you cannot pick something someone else has already picked. Never going to happen. But I want to say when we had Paul on, he might have also picked World in Flames, but can't remember. What matters is you did, so it's on the island now.
Well, that's awesome.
We will be set. Okay, Gary, the next part of our show is the hot seat, which, if you're not familiar, it's just lightning round questions. So don't give it any thought. Just follow your gut. Rapid fire.
Bring it.
All right, you're ready. Here we go. Favorite military topic to play a war game on?
Napoleonics.
Favorite scotch?
Kalila.
Best gaming experience?
Playing with Gary Gygax.
Game you've always wanted to play but haven't?
Artesia Adventures in the Known World.
Favorite comic book character?
Captain America.
Favorite war game series?
OCS.
Favorite game to ever win a CSR award?
Ooh, Empire of the Sun, I believe, won a CSR award.
What war game series has missed for you?
Has missed for me. Combat Commander. Big miss.
Favorite topic to read about?
At the moment, Napoleonics.
Finland or Russia?
Well, boy, that's tough with no context, but today in 2023, we're saying Finland.
Best city to get barbecue in?
Charlotte, North Carolina.
Favorite war game scale?
Favorite operational, not even close.
Game on your table right now?
On the table right now is Last Blitzkrieg from the Gamers.
Awesome. Smoky Jazz Bar or Tiki Bar?
Smoky Jazz Bar.
Fiction or nonfiction?
Lately nonfiction.
If you and I made a band, what would it be called?
Sausage Wagon.
Not okay. Last great book you read?
Last great book I read. It's been a while since I've finished a book. The Family Trade from Charles Stross.
Favorite book?
Favorite book is Lord of Light by Roger Zelazny.
Okay, I'll have to write that one down. Who wins the 2023 Stanley Cup?
The Detroit Red Wings. Totally decent.
Swing and a miss. Favorite Burt Reynolds role?
Oh, God. What's his name from Boogie Nights, I'm sure?
Alien or Aliens?
Alien.
Pacific or Band of Brothers?
Band of Brothers.
Scream or I Know What You Did Last Summer?
Don't care. I'll say Scream because I remember the mask.
Scotch or bourbon?
Scotch.
Chester Nimitz or MacArthur?
Chester Nimitz.
Game
Anybody but Dugout Doug.
Game you want to play in 2023?
Russian Campaign is at the top of the list at the moment.
Favorite RPG class to play?
Favorite RPG, I prefer classless RPGs.
Oh.
But if we're talking, if we're counting Traveler Careers as classes, the Merchant.
Awesome. Best sports movie ever made?
Major League.
Character or DM?
DM. GM, but
GM, sure. Fantasy or sci-fi?
sci-fi.
World War I or World War II?
World War II.
Favorite MMP game?
Favorite MMP game? Jeez. At the moment, I'm going to say Last Blitzkrieg.
Favorite GMT game?
Favorite GMT game is Carthage, the First Punic War.
Awesome. Favorite Compass game?
Favorite Compass game? It's not out yet. Prelude to Revolution.
Ooh, yes. Great choice. What's a war game hidden gem you'd recommend to our listeners?
Ooh, good call. At the moment, I'm researching the virtues of Prussia's Glory 1 and 2 from GMT.
Favorite obscure military topic or battle?
Obscure military topic. I'm tempted to be a wise guy and say the Battle of the Bulge. Nobody's ever played a game about that. Well, obscure in that I've never seen a war game on it. The Anglo-Dutch Wars.
Okay. Favorite war movie?
Favorite war movie is A Bridge Too Far.
If you could design an OCS game about any topic, what would it be?
Late 1944 to mid 1945 East Front.
What board game designer makes the best breakfast?
I have no idea, but I heard a podcast one time where Gene Billingsley made Harold Buchanan breakfast. So I'm going to have to assume that it's Gene.
I remember that one. What's the greatest game ever made?
The greatest game ever made.
There is a right answer to this.
There is a right answer, and I'm not going to give you the right answer. I'm going to give you my greatest game ever made, which is probably World in Flames.
All right. You can breathe. That's it. That's all it is.
That's it?
That's it.
Oh.
What was the book you said? Your favorite book?
Lord of Light by Roger Zelazny.
Lord of Light. Roger. Let's check it out. Awesome. Well, Gary, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. It was a lot of fun. Your wealth of knowledge just in like the history of historical gaming is rather quite impressive.
Matt, it's not about that. What it's about is that I love to hear myself talk. I mean, I really enjoy that. Seriously.
Well, I enjoyed listening and having it thoroughly.
Right now, my wife can hear me in her office, and she's shaking her head. Narcissist.
Where can everyone find you? Plug your stuff.
Easiest way to find me is at Ardwulf's Lair. If you search anywhere, Google, YouTube, whatever, Ardwulf's Lair, ARDWULF, you will come up with me. I'm also on Twitter and not every social media platform, but every social media platform that a person of my age understands. As Ardwulf or some variation thereof.
Love it. All right. Thanks.